Hey, what's going on, everyone? And welcome to episode 15 of the Alec Walt Show. I'm your host, Alec Walt, alongside another very special guest. And today, we're talking about the NBA playoffs. Yes, the NBA regular season ended yesterday. The play-in tournament begins tomorrow. And joining us to preview the NBA play-in tournament is the man who joined us on episode 1 of the Alec Walt Show. It's a pregame and postgame broadcast for the Charlotte Hornets, Rob Longo. Rob, welcome back to the Alec Walt Show, man. I appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alec. It seemed just like yesterday. It was episode 1.
Yeah, it was crazy. It's been just about 2 months or so. I was joking when we ended that show. You know, we could possibly see a Celtics versus Hornets series here in the playoffs. We could still possibly see that. Hopefully we can, but obviously in the play-in tournament, the Celtics played the Wizards and the Pacers. The Hornets play the Pacers. Let's talk a little bit about your Hornets here. One of the main reasons the Celtics aren't seeing them is because they've had a brutal end to the season, losing 5 consecutive games. Rob, what the heck has happened to the Hornets to end the season?
Just too many injuries, to be honest. I mean, I actually have our notes right next to me from the first time that we talked, and we talked about the playoff chances, and I said that they got to stay healthy because they've used 12 different lineups, and that just hasn't been the case this season. Beginning of April, end of March, really, you have LaMelo Ball go out with a wrist injury. He's done for a month. He just came back at the beginning of this month. You have Gordon Hayward go out in the beginning of April, and he's still not back. I mean, he has a foot sprain. It's just one of those things where you got to have to play it by ear. It all kind of reacts differently because there's nothing you can do about it. It's just you put it in a protective walking boot and you sit out and you hope it heals right. PJ Washington, who is on the Hornets now, when he was in college at Kentucky, he got a foot sprain in the SEC tournament, and he still wasn't ready by the time Summer League rolled around. It took him 4 months. So the good news is that, you know, if the Hornets are somehow able to literally play their way into the NBA playoffs with a win over Indiana and the loser of that 7-8 game between the Wizards and the Celtics, then it's maybe possible that we might see Gordon Hayward, but it's going to be very unlikely. He is starting to do some weight-bearing exercises, but again, it's just all reactionary, how his body responds to the rehab. It's going to be tougher. I mean, he's a little bit older now. He's in his early 30s, so, you know, he's not a spring chicken anymore. You can't just, roll out of bed like LaMelo Ball was with his wrist injury, where obviously upper body injuries are a lot different than lower body injuries just because you're able to do a lot of cardio and you're able to stay in shape for the most part. And LaMelo was still doing one-handed drills with his left hand, strengthening his left, even when his right was in a cast. So, LaMelo was able to come back right away. His shooting hasn't been the best because, I mean, obviously, nobody's shooting is going to be great after you've had your arm stabilized and your shooting wrist stabilized for over a month in a cast, and then all of a sudden you're asked to go out and launch 24-foot shots. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So, but he's been effective other ways with passing and rebounding and that sort of thing. But Hornets just haven't stayed healthy. They were starting to hit that stretch a little bit with some tough games. They had, the Clippers. They had the Nuggets to end the regular season. They also had the Knicks, and they had to take the Knicks to overtime on Saturday. And then they had to play Washington on a back-to-back on a tough stretch. So, and Miles Bridges was out with health and safety protocols for 6 games. They were 2-4 in that span. But without Gordon Hayward, Hornets have just kind of fallen off. They are 8-16 without Gordon Hayward in the lineup this season. So, they just haven't been able to stay healthy. They haven't had a 5-game losing streak all season until the end of the year. So it's just not culminating at the right time, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's obviously as a Celtics fan, I've had to see some pretty unfortunate injuries with Gordon Hayward. So it's definitely tough to see as he's found a new team that he's still dealing with lower body injuries. One guy I've noticed that has stepped up really in this last month and a half. Yes, he did have a little bit of issues there with COVID, is Miles Bridges. He's averaged 19.1 points per game in the final month and a half of the season, obviously outside of that spot that he missed some time. Just talk about how big and much of an impact he's made for your team with Gordon Hayward out of the lineup.
He's an energy guy. I mean, when Gordon was healthy and starting, Miles was coming off the bench, and you look back at the middle of the season, beginning of the season, and that was the case. It's kind of hard to believe just because of the way that Miles has played the last month. I mean, it all kind of started, I think, probably in the middle of March when he threw down that monster dunk over Clint Capella. I mean, that was just kind of, he's been doing it all year. He's been, catching alley-oops. He's been throwing down very vicious dunks. But that one really, really, really put him on the radar in terms of the national scale. And I think a lot of people then started to take notice. And he's just not, a rim runner. He can do a lot of different things. I mean, yesterday against the Wizards, he was chucking up threes. I don't remember the stats off the top of my head, but he hit a couple threes. He's been playing really well. He is your quintessential kind of stretch four in a sense where, he's really tough to guard because he's got a lot of size. He can jump out of the building. You see that on a lot of his dunks. And he just brings a lot of energy, if anything. Even if his shooting is off on any given day, any given night, he's still able to bring rebounds. He's still able to provide a spark on the defensive end. I mean, he had a really monster block yesterday against the Wizards that really propelled them to a strong second quarter and able to jump out to a 16-point lead. Unfortunately, they just couldn't hold an 11-point advantage going into the fourth quarter, and they kind of fell apart. And I don't know what to credit that to. I don't know. Bradley Beal started to play out of his mind with a bad hamstring. I mean, he looked really bad in the first half. He went 2 of 11 from the floor and then finished with, I think, 24 or 25 points. Heroic effort by Bradley Beal. So they came on strong in the second half. Obviously, a team that has Russell Westbrook that has all that experience from back when he played in Houston and OKC in a playoff type environment. I mean, obviously, he's going to shine. And that's the other thing, too, is this team is just super young, Miles Bridges included. They have the second – since Gordon Hayward's been out of the lineup, they have the second youngest lineup in the league, and that is outside of Oklahoma City, who is just obviously – they were playing for ping pong balls after the first 2 weeks of the season. So, you got to kind of put things into perspective a little bit with this Hornets team. Like, obviously, we wanted to see a winning record. They already defied expected win-loss rate. A lot of people, out in the desert only had them, I think, pegged for 23 wins, and they end up with 33. So, they finish a little bit higher in that aspect. It's just, not playing good ball at the right time. Shots aren't falling. Injuries starting to pile up. It's just that sort of thing. But Miles Bridges is that one constant this year. Outside of those games he missed due to health and safety protocols, he played in every game. So he's been the rock this season for the Hornets. And, I don't think anybody expected him on Saturday to go out against the Knicks after missing 6 games. We didn't know how his breath was, how his wind was, what his conditioning was like. He goes out and drops 30 points coming off the bench. And then he starts the next day in Washington and has another solid game. So I can't say enough good things about Miles Bridges. The funny thing about it, too, was we were anticipating Gordon Hayward coming back because we heard he would be reevaluated in a month from this foot sprain. So I would have put him in the toward the middle end of May, roughly. So we were thinking, okay, he might be able to come back for a playoff push. And then the question was, well, what do we do with Miles Bridges? Miles Bridges only started because Gordon Hayward was hurt. So, do you shuffle the lineup around? Because Miles can play the 3 a little bit as well. So it's not an issue of, do you want to bring this energy guy off the bench just to kind of balance out the scoring and balance out the lineup a little bit? Or do you do stuff like what Brad Stevens and the Celtics have done this year where they just kind of go all in on that starting lineup and hope that, the bench just kind of holds serve when those guys have to go to the bench and take a break. So, it's been an interesting year, but Miles Bridges has definitely grown more than I think anybody could have anticipated this season.
Well, another guy who I think's definitely exceeded expectations for the Charlotte Hornets is, we all knew he was going to have a good season, Terry Rozier. They always talk about, it's not who you play, it's when you play them. If the Hornets are going to get into the postseason, they need him to play like Scary Terry when he was with the Boston Celtics. Speaking about Sunday's game or yesterday's game, he nearly had a triple-double, and you play a Indiana Pacers team. We'll get into that preview in just a second. That's dealing with some injuries in their backcourt. Talk about, how Rozier has exceeded expectations and how he's playing some pretty good basketball going into this tournament.
I think we touched on it the last time we spoke, but, he just kind of been able to have more playing time, honestly. He didn't have that much time on the floor in Boston just because of the people in front of him. And that's not a slight to Terry. It's just, that's how the way it worked. The Celtics had a very talented backcourt, and then he comes down to Charlotte, and a lot of people were like, well, it works out essentially as a trade because they get Kemba Walker in a sign and trade. And then, the Hornets get Terry Rozier. And last year, Terry played pretty well. All things considered, it was kind of his first year that he was able to get meaningful minutes, valuable time on the floor, being kind of the go-to guy along with Devontae Graham. And then this season, there was, with the additional Gordon Hayward, now it's another piece offensively that teams have to focus on, and that frees up Terry Rozier, obviously. So, he's taken advantage of it. He's done a really good job the last couple of games. He did almost have that triple-double yesterday, but it almost didn't even feel like it just because of the way that he was shooting. His shooting percentage was not great. I don't quite remember off the top of my head, but I think it was maybe like 5 for 18 or something like that. It just wasn't a very good shooting day for him in general. And that's happened the last couple of games. And the biggest reason is because he's had to carry the load offensively, and teams have noticed that on the other side. I mean, I don't think Terry Rozier has seen a double team in the NBA before the last 2 weeks. Teams are starting to double him. They're starting to respect him. And he talked about that. I mean, he's mentioned in postgame press conferences that that's something that he has to work on, especially in the offseason, because he just hasn't been able to deal with that in general. So, the fact that he has to kind of retool his toolkit, and for lack of a better term, going into the offseason and dealing with those double teams, because he hasn't seen that in the past. So, I mean, the last time he probably saw a double team was probably when he was at Louisville for a year. So, other than that, it's just something new. And that's what happens when these injuries pile up is, the offense becomes a little one-dimensional. Thank goodness Miles Bridges came back, because without him, I mean, it's been really stagnant. And, I give James Borrego, the head coach of the Hornets, all the credit in the world trying to deal with managing these injuries. I mean, heck, Sunday's game, they threw out a new lineup that they haven't seen, that these 5 people haven't played together all season. So they've just been constantly tinkering with the lineup, because it's just so tough to find the right fit with all of these injuries.
So, you talk about injuries. You go to the team you're playing tomorrow the team you're playing in the first play-in game with the Indiana Pacers. You look at their injury list, and it's almost never ending. You guys played them 3 times this year. You finished 2-1. Obviously, some of the lineups you may see in this game is different than normal. But just talk about how you guys match up against the Indiana Pacers and some of the things you saw in that matchup this season.
It was obviously a lot different with, once again, Gordon Hayward on the floor. The last time that those 2 teams played, Charlotte beat the Pacers. I think it was the beginning of April, and Gordon Hayward got hurt in that game, and that was the last time we saw him. He was working on a triple-double. I think he had like 12 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists, and then he goes out with I think maybe 5-6 minutes left to go in the second quarter, and all of a sudden he's done for essentially what has been the rest of the year. So, he was a difference maker now, and I think the Hornets had – I don't exactly remember off the top of my head what the lead was at halftime, but they were up at halftime, and they were able to close it out. Team was really resilient. That's a word that James Borrego has used all year long, is resilient. And that one was probably one of their more resilient wins, just because of all the circumstances. I mean, the week before, LaMelo Ball is done for, what reports were saying was the rest of the season. Obviously, those were not right. But, you got LaMelo Ball out at that point. Malik Monk was out at that point, who has been really, when he's healthy, he's been really good for this Hornets team in terms of being a depth point guard coming off the bench, able to score, able to attack the rim. And then Gordon Hayward goes out. So then, at that point, you're kind of cooked. So the following game, they beat the Pacers. I think they had a day off, and then they end up in Boston for a Sunday afternoon game on Easter. And they just came out flat, just not enough firepower, and they end up losing by, I think, 30. I mean, I think it was one of their worst losses of the year, and they just did not come out well. Then, they kind of regrouped, and a couple weeks later they played Boston again, and they end up beating them by, I think, 10 at home. So, it's just kind of one of those things where it all depends when you play the team. So, the toughest part for this matchup coming up for the Hornets is going to be Domantas Sabonis. I mean, the guy has been absolutely crazy the last 2 weeks of the season. I think he's had a couple of triple doubles. I mean, he's just been doing it all. The one positive, obviously you don't root for injuries, but the one positive for the Hornets moving into this one is, no Miles Turner. He's just, he's probably we've called him the Eastern Conference equivalent of Rudy Gobert, just because of the way that he's able to protect the paint, the way he is able to protect the rim, really good shot blocker, really talented, and he's able to, chuck up a couple threes on the offensive end as well. He's a very talented player. He's just been dealing with a foot injury. So, no Miles Turner is going to be helpful for the Hornets, but, they're going to have to regroup. It's more so of not focusing on what the Pacers have. It's more focusing on what the Hornets have and what they're able to work with in that aspect. But again, shutting down Sabonis the best you can. I mean, if you're able to limit him to maybe 12 points, 10 rebounds, and if you're able to limit him to a low triple-double, I think you call that a win, just because he's not the one to beat you, because the center play has been very suspect at times for the Hornets this year. There just hasn't been a lot of consistency. Cody Zeller broke his hand at the beginning of the year. Bismack Biyombo came in, was serviceable. Bismack has been decent off the bench a couple of games down the stretch here. a couple games where he had multiple blocks. So he's a really strong defensive player. Cody Zeller is more of your offensive center. He can still protect the paint for the most part, but yeah, I think he got called for 2 defensive technicals yesterday that resulted in 2 foul shots. Just little things like that might make a difference at the end of the game because, again, the Hornets were down. They were down 113 to 110 yesterday, and 2 free throws at that point. You don't have to foul and hope that they miss free throws, and then you go look at a 3 the other way. So stuff like that, little things. I mean, all those points add up, especially this time of year. So Sabonis against the center play of the Hornets is going to be something to watch out for, especially because the Hornets have gone with a small ball lineup a lot of times this year with P.J. Washington playing the 5. Yeah. And PJ's a little undersized. I mean, he's about 6'8", 6'9", so he's given up a couple inches. He's athletic. I mean, there's nothing wrong with him, playing that position. But when you have a really talented athletic center on the other side, he's going to kill you 11 days out of 10.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys can figure out what to do at the center position, because if you advance into the postseason, the team you play, if you make it, is the Sixers, who probably have the best center in the NBA. So they got some work to do here in this first match against the Bonus. Should be a really awesome game. Now let's go to the other matchup in the Eastern Conference between the Boston Celtics and the Washington Wizards. The Celtics have been awful. The Wizards have been unbelievable. You just saw the Wizards in Charlotte in their loss to end the regular season. Just talk about what you've seen from this Washington team, who's made an absolute move up the standings here to end the season.
Russell Westbrook, man, I mean, he's just been something else. I mean, we know that he's the triple-double machine and the triple-double king, whatever you want to call him these days. He's going to be rewriting that record book for a long, long time, but he has just elevated his play to another level. And Bradley Beal coming back, he played yesterday for the first time in 3 games with a hamstring injury. I honestly thought he was just kind of dead in the water. That first half, I don't know what they did in the locker room. I don't know if it was rest, heat. I don't know what they did, but he came out in that second half and he played unbelievable just based off the way that he played in that first half. Like I said, he started 0 for 6 in the first quarter, 2 for 11 in the first half shooting. I mean, there was a technical foul assessed, and they let him take the free throw, and he missed the free throw. And that was just kind of the day that Bradley Beal was having. And he finishes with 20-plus points. So between him and Russell Westbrook, that backcourt is just really tough. And then you have a guy like Robin Lopez. They brought Robin Lopez off the bench yesterday as their center. Alex Len was their starter. He only played 5 minutes. And Robin Lopez, I mean, I don't know if it's just a testament of how poor the center play has been matchup-wise this year for the Hornets, but he came off the bench. I think he had like 16 points or something like that. He's able to get to his spot in the paint. He has that little half hook shot that he's able to flip in. He's very dangerous. I mean, defensively, not as great, but the Celtics have been trying to navigate life without Jaylen Brown after that injury. And Jason Tatum has just been, Jason Tatum. I mean, if he goes out and he drops 40 or 50 points, Celtics are going to win. If he's limited to 10 or 15, probably not. So it's definitely an interesting matchup just because, for the last week and a half or 2 weeks, it was just kind of pegged as, okay, is Boston going to get into that playing game, or are they going to be able to sneak into that 6 spot? And then once that injury happened to Jaylen Brown, and it was like, okay, well, they're going to get to the 7. They're going to be locked into that 7. They're probably going to play the Hornets for 8. And then the Hornets just kind of faltered down the stretch as well. Not much you can do about that there, obviously, now when it's all said and done. So, the way that the Wizards have been able to play, I think since the beginning of April, they're now 17-10, I want to say. So they've just really turned it around. It's crazy. They have a better record against Western Conference teams than they do against Eastern Conference teams. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it was like they had a winning record against the Western Conference, and they had a losing record against the Eastern Conference, which is just absolutely bonkers to me considering how tough the West has been. And we saw that. I mean, we see that now with teams like the Lakers and the Warriors playing in a play-in tournament. So, I mean, the fact that the Wizards have be able to go out and play those teams, just crazy. So, I mean, all of the momentum is on their side. They really honestly don't have a lot to lose. I mean, I think a lot of the pressure is on Boston just in terms of expectations that they were supposed to have this year. I mean, just in terms of, what people were thinking this was going to be a top 3 team in the East, and they just were not able to get it together for whatever reason. Evan Fournier was their big acquisition at the trade deadline, and he played in a couple really good games. And then he had a stretch where he just didn't do anything for, I think, 4 straight. And now he's starting to heat up again a little bit, which is obviously good for the Celtics. Jason Tatum can't do it all. But it's going to be a really good matchup, this play-in tournament. I mean, I've referenced it a couple times. LeBron has had some pretty strong words on what he said and his thoughts about it. But, Adam Silver is sitting in his commissioner's office, and he's sitting there like Chancellor Palpatine in Star Wars going, good. This is exactly what they wanted. They wanted meaningful games down the stretch. I can't tell you how many, 15 games yesterday in a regular season. I think I want to say maybe 10 of them were meaningful. I mean, a good chunk of them were meaningful just in terms of seeding, people, getting shuffled from the 8-9 and the 9-10 game and that sort of stuff. So, this playing tournament has worked out really well. I just wish that, in this season, I would have rather have not seen it just because of the way it was compact. And I know that was their argument, saying we're going to do it this year because we only played 72 games. But, this season has just been a grind. I mean, the Hornets, talking about just the Hornets, and I know that other teams have been in a similar situation. There were only 2 instances after the All-Star break where they had 2 days off consecutively. Everything else was every other day or back-to-backs. They're playing 3-4 games a week. That's tough to do. I mean, because if you think about it, the season started, end of December, and they end middle of May. And that's 72 games. Normally, you start, beginning of November, you end beginning of April, and you play 82. I mean, you have a little bit of, a couple extra days off for the All-Star break and whatnot. But, just the pace that these teams have played this season is crazy. So the fact that, they have a day off on Monday, and then a lot of these teams got to go play either Tuesday or they got to play Wednesday. And then the playoffs start. So that's another big advantage of why you wanted to be a top 6 team, is because you had a week off before your playoffs started. So, the playoff tournament or the play-in tournament, it's going to be here to stay. It certainly is going to be here to stay. Like I said, I just wish it wasn't this season, just because of the way that the schedules have worked out.
Well, just looking at this season in the Western Conference, it's pretty crazy to think that we could open the playoffs with Steph Curry or LeBron James not in it. Now, obviously, there's a good chance that they do finish as the 7 and 8 respectively, but, there's a chance they're playing in that first 7-8 matchup. Obviously, we didn't expect the Lakers to drop to the 7. They did deal with some injuries this year that prevented them from really climbing in a very, very tight Western Conference. But just give me your thoughts here on this Western Conference game, because LeBron and Steph Curry, we've seen them in the finals before, and now we're seeing them in a play-in tournament.
It's going to be must-watch TV. I'm really excited. I was kind of rooting a little bit down the stretch here. I was like, I hope Portland gets that 6, because I want to see LeBron and Steph go at it in a one-game playoff just to see what happens, what kind of fireworks we get. And, Golden State's kind of already in playoff mode because of Sunday's game. They had to win that game against the Grizzlies in order to secure that 8 spot to play in that 7-8 game, or else they would have been relegated to the 9-10 game, and they would have had to win twice and face the Spurs. So, I'm not going to sleep on anybody coming out of that 9-10 game either. I'm not going to sleep on Greg Popovich in a playoff situation just because of all of his experience and the way that he's been able to maneuver teams in the past that maybe weren't as great or didn't have as great years. But that Golden State Lakers game, the only thing I'm disappointed about it is it's a 10 o'clock start on the East Coast on Wednesday. Obviously, you got to do what you got to do for the local the local TV markets. But I wish that game would have been a little bit of an earlier start time just to maybe get some more eyes on it, because I think that's going to be some must-watch TV. I'm really excited, looking forward to that game. In the Western Conference playoffs and as a whole, it's just, it's going to be a toss-up to kind of see who comes out of that Western Conference. Back when the Hornets had to play the Jazz at the beginning of March, they played them, I think, twice within a 2-week span, one at home and one on the road. And the way that Utah was shooting the 3 ball, I was mesmerized. I'm like, this team's going to win the title. Like, it's no question, just because of the way that they were able to chuck up threes. They looked really good. I mean, they set a franchise record against the Hornets, which Charlotte has given up the most corner threes in the NBA this year, I don't know if that's kind of divine intervention or not just because of those 2 stats, but I really liked Utah going into, watching them play a couple of times. You got, Phoenix at the 2, doesn't look terrible either. Either way, these are all going to be really tough matchups for all of these teams. Portland and Denver, those 2 teams just played on Sunday, and it was Portland kind of coming out with the win. They played for a little bit more to avoid that play-in tournament, but all these series, I would not be surprised if they all go 6 or 7 games. I don't know if we're going to see any sweeps just because of the way that the bracket shakes out. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of fun. The Eastern Conference, obviously, there's some different paths that some other teams can take, but the Western Conference is going to be a lot of fun to watch the next over probably a month or so.
So you talked about the Jazz. I think people still kind of forget about them, even though they're the top team in the Western Conference. If they get the Lakers or the Warriors in the first round, that should be absolutely nuts. But may have just given away one of your answers here, but before the playoffs begin, who do you have winning the Western Conference? Who do you have winning the Eastern Conference? And between those two teams, who is your pre-playoff NBA champion?
Oh, man. I mean, like I said, I think I had Utah pegged since March about winning the title. That's tough. I mean, their path is probably going to be more difficult than, say Philly's in the first round just because of the team that they're going to have to play. So, I mean, I think I'm looking at the bracket now, and I think Utah still probably has the best shot out of the West. I like Phoenix, but they're a little too, excuse my pun for the Suns, but they're a little too hot and cold at times, just in terms of, I mean, the Hornets went out and beat them in the desert. I mean, Charlotte played really well, and it was the beginning of a really long Western Conference road trip, the Suns had to take the Hornets to overtime at home. So, I don't know if it was just a matchup thing or what, but, I don't trust the depth of Phoenix a whole lot. I mean, obviously they played well enough to get the 2 spot. You never know what Kawhi Leonard's going to bring to the table in the 4-5 matchup with Luka and Dallas. I mean, Damian Lillard's always been hard to handle as a 3-6 matchup with Denver, especially with the way that Nikola Jokic has played this year. I think he's probably more than likely your MVP, despite what LeBron has said about Steph Curry. I mean, I would probably rank, Jokic 1 on if I had an MVP ballot, I would probably do Jokic 1 and Curry 2, just because of the way that Steph has been able to carry that team into the playoffs. Again, Hornets played them really well, won it at the buzzer the first time that those two teams played this year. And then out West, Draymond Green had a revenge game and had like an 18-assist triple-double or something crazy like that. Just a typical Draymond game where you're just like, how is he able to have that stat line? Eastern Conference, it's going to be tough. I don't know if the Heat are going to be able to gear up against and make another deep playoff run as a higher seed. I mean, it is a rematch of the conference finals last year against Milwaukee, but I think Milwaukee just kind of has that mentality going in, like revenge series sort of thing. We don't know what Brooklyn's going to do. We saw a little bit of it last night against Cleveland just because of the talent that they have on the floor, but I don't know if all of those guys are going to be able to stay healthy and just kind of culminate at the right time with chemistry, since they haven't played together a whole lot this year. You never know. Tom Thibodeau style with the Knicks kind of suits playoff basketball. I mean, just because of the terms of, they slow the pace down, they play defense, they want the game to be 1990s NBA style where it's in the 80s and the 90s. You're not getting into 100, 110, 120 points. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting matchup in that 4-5. As much as it pains me to pick Philly, I just think Joel Embiid is too good. I'd probably put him at 3rd on my MVP ballot just because of the time that he's missed this year. Just an absolute elite center, a guy that just can play both sides of the floor. He's just been so great this season. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see who comes out of I'm assuming it's going to be the 1 and 2 matchup between Brooklyn and Philly. But I can't get away from Utah. It's a tough place to play this year. I think they only had like 4 losses at home this season. They had a 22-game win streak at home at one point this year, which broke their previous record that they had in the 90s when they played MJ and the Bulls. So, history has a way of repeating itself, and I think this time maybe the Jazz get over the hump.
In a league where big men are not as they're still important, but the 2 of the better big men in the league you have going to the finals. That is crazy. Well, Rob, hopefully we see Philadelphia and Utah for your sake in the NBA finals. Hopefully the Celtics and the Wizards can find a way, or not the Wizards, the Hornets can find a way to get into the NBA playoffs. It should be an absolutely awesome couple of days. Rob, before we let you go, how can our listeners keep in touch with you on social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Rob_Longo. We have our daily podcast, the Hornets Hivecast, if you want to check out the Hornets. Those are just kind of the basic 2 ways. Sam Farber and I are usually the co-host on that. Sometimes Sam will bring in somebody else and give me a break because, I don't like the sound of my own voice. So it's nice to have somebody else come on there. So, those are kind of the 2 main ways. We got, our Hornets Hivecast. It's anywhere you can get your podcast. We've even been starting to put it up on YouTube as well if you like to have a pretty picture of clouds as you listen to your podcast or whatnot. So, those are the main 2 ways. But, as always, appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, Rob, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's pretty crazy. You were on episode 1. Now you're on episode 15. We're definitely going to have you come on a show later again talking some Charlotte Hornets basketball. That's going to be it for this episode of the Alec Walt Show. I'm Alec Walt alongside Rob Longo. What are your predictions for the NBA play-in series? Feel free to comment that below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Down the Block Sports for more of my exclusive content. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you very soon.